I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Mike Van Amburgh, professor in the Department of Animal Science, and the Stephen H. Weiss Presidential Fellow at Cornell University. Dr. Van Amburgh is a native of Ohio, has his bachelor's degree from Ohio State, his PhD from Cornell, and has been on faculty at Cornell for a number of years. Obviously very well known. I really think of you as really having two aspects to your research, right? The calf and heifer work that you've done, so I'll give you a plug for your workshop this afternoon around calves, and then really leading the efforts around the CNCPS model and research around nitrogen metabolism and fiber and so forth. So let's welcome Dr. Van Amburgh.
Thanks, Meg. Hi, everybody. Oh, there we go. First slide. I didn't even push the button yet. Okay, so I'm talking about milk components. What Clay and Scott requested. This is the first time that Scott hasn't given me a title in a while, so I don't have to make something up. As a fraternity brother, he'll just say, well, you can come do this, right? And give me the title, and I got to figure it out. But they wanted me to talk about, there's a theme to this, right? We did methionine, we did histidine. They want me to talk about lysine. I'm going to get to it. I recognize Alex as a co-author on some of this. I'm going to take a slightly different approach first, though, because Jackie's talk this morning was really good, because she pointed out that there's a lot of movement of amino acids through the system, and those amino acids were moving through the system and they weren't going to milk protein all the time. That's really important when we're trying to figure out what the efficiency of use of these amino acids are and how do we feed the current cow that we have. And I won't talk a lot about genetics today, but we do have to recognize that the cows are changing. We need to be conscious of this. Their requirements, as Scott pointed out earlier, I will stand up here and say I'm not always sure we know how to feed these cows today, and that's not my talk, so we'll leave that alone after that. But we do have updated requirements and estimates of amino acid supplies and some considerations for other nutrients, but that might require context. And I won't have time to do all of it, but I will try to give you some context about how I view amino acid utilization. I think the other thing that we have to, I think this has been a problem in dairy cattle nutrition for a long time. We somehow kind of co-opted the idea of amino acids going to milk protein, right? As it was linear. And we have to stop doing that because it's not linear. Protein synthesis is required for lactose, fat, fatty acids, and milk protein. I don't know if I'm going to talk about this or not, but we know that carbon goes into all three of those components. So that means it's not going linearly, it's going this way, right? Our efficiencies have to include that concept. So we have to recognize that it's not just related to milk protein output, it's related to energy-corrected milk. And if I don't remember to say this later, I will tell you that our way of dealing with this now within the structure of the CNCPS is actually to tell you to formulate around energy-corrected milk, because that's capturing more of the nutrient utilization that you have coming out of that cow based on what you're feeding her. The milk volume, and it's more related to lactose, is the legacy thing that we have from the data that was generated back in the 60s and 70s. These cows have so much protein synthetic activity that we now should be looking at energy-corrected milk because that's capturing everything that we're doing. That's a whole talk in itself, but I just wanted to get that out on the table, right? So, and I've used this, Alex built this slide last week at a talk. Adam was giving me a hard time, Adam Locke, because Alex did her master's with Adam and built him a very similar slide. And I got to go first, so I used it first. But anyhow, this analogy to me, I think, is really important, right? We want to make lactose, fat, and protein. An energy analogy, or a machine analogy, is probably not always appropriate for a cow, right? It kind of it just takes the animal out of it. But I think the point is that these systems are running all the time. If everything shows up that's needed to make those components, then our energetic efficiency increases. When we only get a couple of them, the machine is still running, but it never fully makes the endpoint, the product, which means that we just wasted what? We wasted a bunch of energy, right? So when we meet all these requirements, all of a sudden what we really see the cow doing is increasing their energetic efficiency. We used to drive that all through nitrogen efficiency, and I think that's misguided because that's kind of that linear thinking when in fact, as we meet all these requirements, she's making more of all of those components, and that makes the system run more efficiently. So that's why I think energy-corrected milk is probably a better way to think about this, because all of these things are required for those three endpoints, right? So how should we reconsider the requirements, and how does this change our perspective on efficiencies, right? So I'm just going to follow down this line of thinking. By the way, this is a cow from Parma, Italy. I took a picture of her. Everywhere I walked on the farm, that's how she looked at me. Right? So I finally took a picture of her. I walked around the barn. She was staring at me like that the whole time. I don't know if it was an ex-girlfriend or something, but whatever. But she was intent on me for some reason. Anyhow, one of the things that actually helped our thinking was a paper published by Gerald Bobley, 2007. That name might not be known to a lot of you. Gerald worked at the Rout Research Institute. He was preeminent in the world in amino acid and metabolism in general. He worked in both animals and humans and animals. There we go, I'll get it out. But he wrote this in one of his papers, right? And this to me really caught my attention because it kind of solidified how I thought I was seeing things. It's been established, it's been traditional to consider protein and energy as separate in metabolism. Most scientists recognize this as artificial. They should be considered together, as this reflects how the nutrients are ingested and utilized as part of normal feeding patterns, right? In other words, and the title of the paper was Protein and Energy Interactions, Horizontal Aspects, and he actually detailed a couple studies where he showed amino acid carbon going in and ending up in the adipose tissue, ending up in the lactose, and ending up in the amino acids, which meant we can't just have a linear line to milk protein because we're going to screw everything up, right? And if there's a problem, I don't want to pick on the Nason committee, but if there's anything they did that makes it really difficult to reconcile, is they drove all those efficiencies through milk protein. When we know, in fact, they're all going through all these different pathways, right? So we have to be conscious of that. If you look, I'm not going to do a lot of this, don't brace yourself, right? We're not going through 20 slides like this. But if you think these are mammary explants, this was elegant work by Brian Beckett. If you just think about, here's a pathway, right? Gluconeogenesis, glycolysis, whichever way you want to go. Oxaloacetate, right? 63 to 84% of it from valine, isoleucine, and threonine. Succinate in the pathway, threonine, valine, isoleucine. Alpha-ketoglutarate to glutamate, valine, isoleucine, threonine. You guys see a pattern here? Acetyl-CoA carboxylase, right? Threonine, leucine, lysine, isoleucine. Yes, you've got other substrates there, but notice where the amino acids are tied. They're going into energy pathways, right? So our efficiencies have to figure out how to incorporate that utilization because it's not just going to milk protein. That changes the way we have to think about this. Yeah, here's the paper by Lobley. I'm going to go fast through this. You've got group 1, group 2, and group 3 amino acids. These are in and out of the mammary gland at the same rate. There's more in than out here with these branched chain lysine, threonine. That's interesting, right? More in than out. That means amino acids that are very essential, like lysine, are being converted. Helene LaPierre and I used to have really hard conversations about this because she'd say to me, Mike, why if lysine is such a limiting amino acid, is it being catabolized in the mammary gland? I said, well, there must be some other uses. And I'm going to come to that. I'm targeting the lysine because that was what the request was, is to focus on lysine, so I'm going to come back to that. And we can do that with the group 3s too, right? But he was able to show, I'm sorry, but he was also able, wrong button, Amber. He was able to show that there's also exchanges, right, within the system. So the group 2s are moving to group 3s, right? So all of a sudden you've got all sorts of things going on that you've got to account for. And he actually went to the point of reducing, taking some carbons off and saying, hey, leucine and lysine can go to acetoacetate, that can go to energy lipid, but no carbon for non-essential amino acids or glucose, right? Or he went isoleucine and valine, removed some carbons, get propionyl-CoA, you've got energy for lipid or glucose. So all of a sudden, our branched chains and lysine are moving through different pathways completely unrelated to protein synthesis, right? We have to capture that information when we're putting our efficiencies together. Yeah, you guys got the point? Okay, so what do we get to? Well, the way we traditionally calculated the requirements was to say, okay, we got milk, pregnancy, growth, reserves, and maintenance. But what we have to add to this is oxidation, anaplerosis, synthesizing non-essential amino acids, and gluconeogenesis, okay? Jackie's, and some of this is captured in what Jackie talked about with all the exchange with the muscle, right? That's movement in and out, whether that's oxidation, mobilization, resynthesis, all sorts of things are going on there. That's part of this process, okay? So with all that in mind, and this was done a long time ago now, we re-derived all of this, Ryan Higgs. We do have a paper out, we're working on the rest of them now, and we feel comfortable with where we're at. We re-derived all 10 essential amino acids, and the way we did it on a gram of energy, gram amino acid per mcal of Me, right? Just like pretty similar to monogastric. And if the only other data set in the world that looks at it similarly is one that Helene Lapierre had, and this is the only time she ever talked about it this way, and she presented it at the Cornell Nutrition Conference in 2007, so that's why I'm showing this data, and she shows her efficiencies of use versus what we came up with from our own analysis, right? And for the most part, they're all in the ballpark. You get to leucine, our efficiency is higher, hers is lower. That would say that she would say we need more leucine than we're estimating. We're gonna test some of those boundaries here. Lysine's pretty much spot on. Our methionine is lower than hers. She said, why do you think that is? I said because if this was a monogastric, we talk about sulfur amino acids, there's probably a cysteine requirement, and we don't talk about that, right? It's probably not really big, but there's a cysteine requirement, so we capture that in the methionine, okay? That's why this is lower. Phenylalanine, threonine, a little bit. Tryptophan, they didn't have one. Valine, we're pretty much on top, right? So we get to these grams per mcal. Some of you have seen this before, right? If you look at the old way of doing this, the older way of doing this is a percent of essentials, 15.1 and 5.7 for lysine and methionine. Schwab said 14.9 and 5.1. Rolquin, a few years earlier, said 14.7 and 5.3, right? So that gives us some comfort, high 14s, we're at 15.1. Re-derived in a completely different mathematical approach and came to a similar answer. We're different, right? We're higher on the methionine than what those two would have come up with. That's okay, still in the neighborhood. So this gave us some comfort that these numbers weren't really that far out of bounds, right? Just different. So if we extend them, right, there were a couple folks that we worked with, some groups that said, hey, it's going to take you a long time to get version 7 out. Can you re-derive this stuff in version 6.5, which is what we're all using? So we did, methionine at 1.19, histidine. Alex, those numbers actually that you gave, the 74 grams based on the mcals, I went back and looked at it, you were pretty much right on with this, so that was good. Lysine at 3.2 grams per mcal, right? And when we do this, right, and some feedback has come from some pretty good nutritionists that will tell us, hey, when this is a little bit higher, we actually get a better response, right? And that gets into the whole genotype thing, but we don't have time for that today. So we pegged this at 1.19. I'm getting some feedback that says maybe set it at 1.24 or 1.25. Get about 10 grams more histidine than you have methionine. Again, we need to work that out, but I'm giving you that feedback because that's what we've received. Right, so here's the study. Some of you have seen this, some of you haven't. Hopefully it gets accepted here. We're in the second round of review, so maybe it does. has nothing to do with amino acids, right? It was a dose titration of rumensin. The only thing that worked here for me, I didn't want to do this. I said no. They said, hey, you can build whatever diet you want. We want a modern diet. We don't really care. Well, perfect. We can take everything we've learned and apply it to these cows, right? And we did. Here's the most important thing. They were about 90 pounds of milk. Sorry, I missed that kilo. They're about 90 pounds of milk, about 4-1 fat and 3-1 true protein, and 120 days at assignment. Okay, so I want to give you that context because everybody got fed the same diet except for you know, the rumensin. So here's our haylage corn silage. There's all of our ingredients, right? We've got a mix of fatty acids. We've got some room-protected methionine and lysine, some yeast, you know, some blood meal, some dextrose. We like sugar, need some more butyrate, citrus, things like that, right? Protein was about 15.7, NDF about 32, sugar about 5, starch 26, ether extract about 4.4. That looks really low to a lot of people, but I think that's important. We won't have time for that today. Methionine and lysine, you know, at about 82 and 222 at formulation. There we go. Cows consumed about 71 to 72 mCals, so that puts the metabolizable methionine at 85, the lysine at 229, and the histidine at 85. Does this look intimidating to anybody in the room? Nope? You guys good with this? All right, because it's going to go up. It was just this study. Right? There's cows that I'm working with where we're hitting 290. How's that on intakes? Yeah, it's intimidating. But that means these guys are where? About 110, 120. Same with the other one, right? So these cows are doing some interesting things, right? So why is this important, all right? How did so the cows are about 190 days by the time we analyzed them at the end. They went from about 90 pounds to about 87, 88, 86 pounds of milk volume. Energy-corrected milk was just over 100. Here's the milk fats, 4.6, 4.67, 4.72, 4.67. And the true proteins went from 3.1 to almost 3.4, okay? We did not anticipate this response. We had no idea why those cows were doing that. Dave Barbano is analyzing our milk. He calls me up and says, hey, you know, are those jerseys, right? And I assured him no, they were black and white. And he said they can't be, right? But we did not expect this response, right? This is gonna lead back to the whole lysine thing, right? So keep this in mind because we had to ask ourselves, you know, why are these cows doing this? This is not what we expected, right? You feed more amino acids and you balance the fatty acids and the sugar, and we would expect this, right? We were expecting something like this. Completely unexpected, right? So we had to go back to work and figure out why that is. What was fascinating about it is that Dave measures all the de novos, and they were different, and the rumensin actually enhanced that, right? So when you looked at the de novos in the mixed, rumensin actually enhanced that. It was significant, and that would fit with the mode of action, right? If you're shutting down some methane and you're pushing more propionate out, you're gonna have more glucose, and that would allow for more extension, right? So that all fits with our model of de novo and mixed fatty acids, so that kind of made sense, right? But then here's why Barbano thought that this was a problem, right? They can't be Holsteins. Here's his Holstein data that he published in 2019 from the Northeast herds that he worked on with Minor Institute. Here's these cows. There's the jerseys, right? So you have Holsteins making fat, especially the de novos in the mix, like jerseys. Okay, that's interesting. We'd never seen that before. Dave didn't think that was real. We've gone back now and we figured out that we can do this with high accuracy. All right, so then that leads to which memory fatty acids are involved in this and how are they responsible, you know, how are these amino acids responsible for that fat synthesis in milk yield? We did another study, right? And one of the things we received a room-protected methionine product, happens to be RP Met. but it was still a prototype, and they said, hey, could you test this? And we said, yes, we'd be happy to do that, but we want to do it when we know that lysine and histidine is not considered first or co-limiting. So the study design was the same as what I just showed you. So the histidine was set at 1.19 for all 3 treatments. The lysine was set at 3.2, and then we titrated in the methionine. No supplementation, full supplementation, and we picked the mathematical middle, right, and said, okay, we'll do a dose titration on that. We didn't get to build the diets from scratch for this study, so we had to kind of work around an existing diet at the research farm, but nonetheless, it turned out okay. 144 cows, 16 cows per pen, fed to refusal, 5% refusal, all the things we do. One of the other things that I want to point out, and I didn't talk about this in the first study, all of our pen studies have primiparous cows in them. So it's always, in a 16 cow pen, we always have 12 multiparous cows and then 4 primiparous cows. That was true in the last study that I showed you. So those high fat responses, those protein responses also had primiparous cows in there, right? Just to get down the idea that they'll respond the same way if we give them enough nutrients, which was kind of what Jackie was talking about this morning. Right, we went for 70 days, measured everything. Like we always do, here's the diets, right? Grain mix, the only thing that's different here is the grain mix. There's our titration on the methionine, and there's the room protected methionine prototype down here. So here we go, dry matter intakes, around 58 pounds, milk yield, cows are making about 98, 99 pounds, energy corrected milk, 107 to 111, looks pretty good. Feed efficiencies on an energy-corrected milk basis are good, right? 187 to 192. I encourage a lot of people to start using this metric because I think it's a great way to do. You can either do solids efficiency. I like this one because I think it's a more holistic way to get these efficiencies and understand the value of your diet and the response. Milk protein stepped right up. Milk fat didn't really increase at the first supplementation, but by the time we got to full supplementation, we also saw an increase in the milk fat, just like we did on the prior one. I think if we could have started from scratch on these diets, we could have stepped it up like we did on the first study. That's okay, we still got a nice response. But notice that the full response to the methionine only occurred under the conditions, and I think this is important. Here we've got all the histidine and we've got all the lysine, right? This is always the question, can I just feed one of those and get something out of it? Well, you can, but you're not going to get the full response, right? And that's why we like doing it this way, because as you get to full methionine, full lysine, full histidine, now we see, a more optimum response to all 3 of them in the components, right? I have a problem. Can somebody forward this? Oh, there we go. A little delay there. So if we look at, we just look at it graphically, right? We got a 3.5 pound increase in energy corrected milk. We've got an 8% increase in milk protein. There we go. De novos, as in the previous study, the de novos stepped right up. The mixed stepped right up, right? The significant difference in percent de novos. This is, again, Barbano calls us up, and this I think is interesting, and this should be something we are always contemplating, although the market's not ready for this. We should know how to do this. Dave called me up and he said, who are those cows? And I said, why are you calling me about those cows? He said, those are really interesting cows. I said, what's interesting? He said, their milk fat has a fatty acid profile that would allow me to make spreadable butter right out of the refrigerator. We could patent that idea. He said, yep, okay. He says, you gotta go get some of that milk fat. I said, I don't have time and you don't have time to make the butter, right? But we know how to do it, so we can go back when we both have time, because I'm not gonna ask my group to do one more thing, right? Because we'd have to get a whole lot of milk to make that butter, right? But anyhow, there's the idea that the milk chemist said, what? We can modify milk to change its manufacturing properties. And we're learning how to do that, right? And it's on the fat side, right? That's kind of cool. And it's through amino acids. That's even cooler, right? So if we look at the de novos, we see that those cows automatically, responded pretty immediately. Not automatically, but immediately responded to the diets. You knew when they were being supplemented, right? There's no treatment, intermediate, and the full, right? And they maintained it all the way through. Alex pulled this together. We've got 5,100 cows that we've done research on from 3 studies. Not 5,100 cows, we've got 5,100 observations from all those cows. So we looked at the relationship between study-adjusted fat and de novo and mixed, and we see this very strong relationship, right? So this is helping us, understand that, we're going to see nice responses to amino acids if we do this right, and a lot of that's going to come from de novo and mixed fatty acids. And it's just reassuring that it's a fairly uniform response, right? It does beg the question, why is one of the first things the cow does when you feed her these amino acids is increase milk fat, right? This was a big discussion a couple of weeks ago. Paul Koninoff spoke at our Cornell Nutrition Conference, and while he was up there speaking, he was talking about energetics, and he said one of the most energetically demanding things to do is to make de novo and mixed fats. My first thought was, well, that's interesting. Why is that the first thing she does then? Especially when you give her amino acids, right? And Paul and I are still in a conversation. We just got to get on a Zoom call or whatever and kind of have this out, because I think he's thinking about the energetic value of it and what comes out of it. But I still don't quite understand why he would say that, because this seems to be the first thing the cow does, right? So how do we interpret this metabolic interaction between amino acids and milk components, and especially fat? So here's where I'm going to come back to lysine, right? And I don't spend a lot of time talking about mTOR. I've had to understand it. I appreciate it. I appreciate all my colleagues that do the work on mTOR. But if you've got some primary energy signaling up on top, you've got things like methionine or leucine coming in here to do some stimulation. And then if everything works right, we start moving down to some other functions, right? Upregulating some genes for beta-casein, this SRBP1, right? We're upregulating that, getting more synthesis, doing some translocation, however you want to look at it. But I think what's interesting, and then if you follow it all the way through, we get to lipids, we get to cell growth, and we get to protein synthesis, which is what we need for lactation. What I find interesting is, I think one of the things that we can do is we can turn all this on. Here's my interpretation of what's going on right now. We can turn all of this on. I think it is in that master regulatory function, but we can then just disassemble it down here if we don't provide enough amino acids. Right? And that sounds funny, but acetyl-CoA carboxylase, fatty acid synthetase, and steryl-CoA desaturase are all enzymes, which means if we want more enzymes, we have to have more what? We need to have more amino acids to do the work and to stimulate them, right? So all of a sudden you get to a very different way of thinking, right? So it's not just we're stimulating up here, we've got to follow through, because we can make the same argument for casein, right? And I won't get to this, we'll see if I get to this, but non-essentials also play into this process, and we rarely talk about them. It's not my first day driving one of these things. I'm pushing the button and nothing's happening. I gotta push it someplace else. There, that one worked. Okay. So, here's some leucine methionine increases in SRBP synthesis through transcription cofactors in bovine mammary epithelial cells. So we're looking at primary cells. So here's a study where they looked at secretion of triglycerides. There's the control. They add a methionine and leucine, and they see a nice response in SRBP1. They look at CAR2 levels, and they see nice response. They look at SRBP1 protein levels, and they see nice responses, right? So we've got some interaction there. That would fall into the mTOR signaling. And then if we put an inhibitor in there, we can shut it down, right? So this very clearly shows, hey, with leucine and methionine on the top side, we can stimulate mTOR. Well, I'm going to go down a step now, though, right? Oops. Yep, okay. So if we look at SRBP1 here, so this is the effect of looking at lysine in bovine memory cell culture on milk fat synthesis in the absence of fatty acids. So they're titrating in the lysine, and you see you're getting more upregulation of SRBP1, and then you get to a certain level and it shuts down, right? That's okay. This is clearly saying, hey, if you give me more lysine, I'm going to translocate and upregulate the protein. If you look at lipid droplet density in the culture, as you titrate in the lysine, we're getting more lipid synthesis from the cells, right? And there's still some there at this level, and then it kind of wanes again, right? So that's interesting. This is in the absence of fatty acids. Thank you. So if you look at in the presence of fatty acids, and for those of you who feed cows, these two fatty acids will be pretty familiar, palmitic and oleic. So they picked good fatty acids to play with, 50 micromolar of each. They looked at the same thing, SRBP1 protein levels, and now they titrated in the lysine in the presence of those, and now we see a much larger increase, still up, but not so much, right? You come to the secretion of triglycerides, a larger increase in triglycerides, and when you look at lipid droplet density in the media, you see this really nice increase, and in the presence of the fatty acids, you see it maintaining, which means there's an interaction between the lysine and the presence of the fatty acids. They're working in synergy, right? Which means if we're going to feed more fatty acids, we have to do what? Feed more lysine. Because in these papers, they're actually saying lysine is inducing the enzymes. How's that? Kind of powerful? It's really interesting because that's what this looks like, right? So, you know, we got to keep that in mind. Okay, so then if you put it all together, right, you look at secretion of triglycerides, nothing, lysine, fatty acids, lysine plus fatty acids, it steps right up. SRBP1, lysine, an effect, fatty acids, an effect, put them together, we see a synergy, right? So we can feed fat without the lysine, but what's going to happen? Not a whole lot. We can feed lysine without the fat. You're going to get some response. You put the two of them together, right? This helps explain in that first study why we saw those big increases in milk fat, in de novo fat, right? Because we fed a lot of lysine compared to prior studies. If you look at fatty acid binding protein 5, you see a nice response. It doesn't really care which one you give it, it's just going to respond. Right? No real synergy there, but it's absolutely necessary for this process. Right? But you see this nice synergy between that. And this helps explain why when we feed these amino acids, especially the lysine, along with everything else that we're seeing these really interesting responses in milk fat. Okay, so in the study, bovine mammary epithelial cells, lysine-induced SRBP1 expression, looks like it's a key regulator of fatty acid synthesis in the mammary gland. It's also sensitive to insulin. There's lots of different pathways we could choose, and we see responses in other proteins within the system, right? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on all of that. Sorry guys, this isn't working. To go to fatty acid synthetase now, just one slide here to change gears. You know, that's responsible for de novo fatty acids, right? That's the enzyme that's putting on the next carbon as we build the fatty acid chain. There's active sites with essential amino acid essentials for function and transfer. They looked at elongation of de novos, and they found histidines required, lysines required, serines required, and cysteines required, right? They looked in human liver tissue. This is kind of fun because the enzyme is highly conserved, and they found that when histidine and lysine were deficient, they couldn't make fat. It was reversible when they introduced it, right? So it doesn't really matter what tissue we look at, we see the same responses. Lysine's important, histidine and lysine are important in the synthesis, and even some non-essentials are important here. It's some work out of Japan many years ago clearly showed that fatty acid synthetase was complex and likely required both non-essential and essential amino acids. So, how well does this work on commercial dairies? Next slide. Because this is all translated to at least one person in the room, this will look familiar. So, there's herds not too far from here. Working with a small nutrition company, a nutritionist said, hey, you know, maybe if you try this, and I'm showing this not because we're in the neighborhood, but I'm showing this because one of the questions that I get is sometimes I can't group my cows, right? Sometimes I have to feed the whole herd, right? So will the whole herd respond? And that's why I also made the point about having primiparous and multiparous cows in all of our Penn studies, right? So nutritionists, you know, had these cows that were making a lot of milk. They were about 4.2 on fat, about 3.1 prior to the change. Using the amino acid concepts that we just talked about, moved them up to 4.6, 4.7, almost up to 3.5 true protein, you know, got them in the 7-pound club, right? But on a whole herd basis, okay? Just by amino acid balancing, right? Didn't lose any milk, didn't change milk. So it is possible. If we look at, this is a large herd north of the Adirondacks I get to work with, and it's been a journey for these guys, and we've learned a lot. That's a whole different discussion, but you know, the bulk tank, the average butterfat shipped, this was Easter Sunday. He sent me this. This is a text message I got on Easter Sunday, was this screen capture. I said, don't you have something better to do today? And, but anyhow, he said, hey, here's our milk fats and our proteins. And they had struggled, they were up, they were down, they were up, they were down. They finally had them back up, and we figured out why they kept dropping, right? They got Holsteins and Jerseys. The Jerseys are now gone as of a month ago, 2 months ago. But here's the Holsteins 4.89, 4.87. Jerseys were at 5.4. Here's the Holsteins 3.53, 3.54. Jerseys at 3.66, right? So the Holsteins in this herd are doing what? Catching up to the Jerseys on protein, right? Not doing too bad on fat either, right? Because this is a pretty high producing herd. Here's the thing that you guys need to be aware of, right? And one of the reasons I like working with this herd is he's got these guys. So he does in vitro fertilization, shortens down the generation interval a lot. So he's got about 250, 300 genomic Holsteins in the same herd, fed a similar diet. Actually, there's a story here. They're 88 plus pounds of milk. They're greater than 5.2 fat and greater than 3.8 true protein. The last numbers I got from him were 5.6 fat and 3.9 true protein. And they were hitting, the high-end girls were hitting 7% and 4 to 4.1. What does that make you think? Is that intimidating? Yeah, the processors don't like that. This is actually not too bad. If we can get this up like this, this is okay. So in a conversation with the herd owner, I said, I'd like to come up and do a genotype by nutrition interaction study on this. He goes, well, you're in luck, because I just sold the Jerseys and I got a bunch of unselected Holsteins. So we have a good control now. So we are trying to set that up. But I said something to him about what we would like to do, and he said, oh, that's funny. We're already doing that. So what do you mean? He says, well, my nutritionist was here and my genetics guy was here, and they were looking at these heifers and they said, well, why don't you just give me some more? So what did they do? They doubled the amount of the amino acids, right? And that's when they went from 5.2 to 5.6, and that's when these guys went to 7. How's that? That's a genotype effect, right? So this is the cow we have coming at us, and today, with genomic selection, everybody has these cows, right? These guys have done something, you know, a little crazy because they've shortened the generation interval so much, so they're a little farther ahead. But for the most part, everybody's got these cows because of genomic selection, right? So we need to be conscious of that. Here's a herd that I also work with. This is more in the neighborhood. They're about a 34,000 pound herd. Their bulk tank, when everything is working right, is averaging 4.9 to 5. Is that interesting? Been hitting 3.5 to 3.6 on protein. Sorry, I never fixed that kilogram. So get us to about 165 pounds. So the energy-corrected milk in the high group is averaging 165 pounds or better. And their feed efficiency, the last time we trusted the dry matter intake data, was 2.1. Is that exciting on an energy-corrected milk basis? Yeah. So did they do this overnight? No, it took us a long time to iterate up to this. But this tells you what's possible. And again, the point, do we anticipate this with better amino acid balancing? We didn't. We do now, right? When you get enough amino acids in there, right? Shoot. So let's talk about those cows for a minute, right? So those cows, let's say that we're looking at 100, I missed one. So this is 130 pounds of energy-corrected milk. That's about 87 mCals. So the cows in that herd that I just showed you at 130 pounds of energy-corrected milk would be at 103, 103, and 278 grams of lysine. How's that? We started here, right? That's just eating their way into that. But I show you this because I've had a bunch of people say, I've tried the amino acids and they just don't work. And most of the time, if they're willing to give me the answer, I said, how much did you add? Well, I added 10 grams. Well, you didn't balance for amino acids. Even when you said you added 20 grams, you still didn't balance for amino acids. Because at a metabolizable level, you have to be where? Way beyond all of that on these cows to actually see a response, right? So this is something we're all going to have to learn to get comfortable with because this is a nutrient requirement, right? They're not feed additives. They're not feed additives. These are nutrients. We know where they work. We know how they work. We just need to know the bioavailability, as was talked about earlier, and then we need to go. So, under the current selection conditions, I think cows are an innovation, and we likely have a genotype we don't fully understand. This says, hey, when we meet the amino acid requirements, it enhances energetic efficiency equal to nitrogen efficiency and directly impacts milk fat synthesis. We've got Holstein cattle that can produce milk fat like Jersey cow when fed an appropriate diet. In established lactation, methionine, lysine, and histidine appear to be the top 3 limiting amino acids. If you want more milk or fat, lysine is key in that process, right? And I think that is the slides are having hard. There we go, that's it. Thanks to everybody who keeps this going. Any questions? You do. Sure. If you know how to make this work, that would be better.
Yes, maybe we'll get it figured out here. All right, excellent talk, Mike. Thank you. So, we've got a number of questions coming in here. So, you talked a little bit, about the high components and how that is affecting the processors at this point. Are you aware there are any dairy co-ops that are considering either penalizing for really high milk fat content or rewarding people for higher protein in the milk?
Yeah. So I'm aware of 2 co-ops in the U.S., mostly in the West, although I've heard there's one in the Midwest now, that is only paying full price for fat to the level that the protein will allow for cheese. Somebody in the room here told me this morning that he got a call yesterday that says DFA is going to start penalizing for high fat.
Wow.
So fasten your seatbelt.
Wow.
The problem, no, but the second part of the question is something that we're if there's anything that my group is focused on right now, is how do we turn on the protein, right? The New York State Cheese Producers Association had a meeting a couple years ago. They invited me and Dave Barbano in. Dave gave his talk, I gave my talk. They said, hey, we don't want to penalize dairy producers for finally making high component milk. And then they pointed to me and said, but you better fix it, right? And the better fix it part of it was you've got to figure out how to get the protein up so we don't have to skim all this milk to make legal cheddar, right? So this is becoming a real problem, and I think they've tried to say we don't want to penalize dairy producers, but I think there's so much fat coming right now that they're feeling the pressure, right? And we're seeing it at the fat price, right?
Right. Right.
It's dropping. Now, the protein thing is a dilemma. I don't know how we're going to do that.
What are your grams metabolized amino acid ME targets for fresh cows?
The fresh cows, I think, Tom, where's Overton? Are you going to talk about that this afternoon or tomorrow, whatever? Yeah, I'm going to let Tom deal with that, but it's going to be higher. So on a gram per mcal, I'm just going to spitball this for those of you that are here, but Tom will give you more information this afternoon. It'd be about 1.24 for methionine and maybe 3.3 to 3.5 for lysine. It's a little bit higher given the intake.
Okay. How do branch chain amino acids play into the increase in milk fat and protein?
Yeah, the branch chains. Well, there's two things, right? You got the branch chain VFAs in the rumen. I'm going to keep those separate. The branch chain, so I showed you that slide that Alex put together where we put all of our data back through the models and we analyze everything. So when we put this all back through version 7 would say there's three things that come up first limiting on making more casein. It's either leucine, isoleucine, or proline, right? So when you say the word proline, we're probably not going to make a rumen-protected proline, but we could make a rumen-protected arginine, right? And that's going to feed into that whole thing. So it says that, so if you take that, then it's lysine, or it's leucine, isoleucine, and arginine that may be first limiting to turn that protein thing on.
Okay, one final question here. So I think this is in relation to the Northern New York farm where you had the Holsteins and the Jerseys. Do Jerseys respond the same to amino acid supplementation as the Holsteins?
Yeah, so the data from that herd and a little bit of anecdotal data from some other herds that I have tried to help, I think, or just talk about, not nearly as much as a Holstein. And in a talk that I gave 2 weeks ago, and I have those slides, I can send them to you. Since genomics, since genomics have taken on, if you look at lactose or if you look at milk, Holsteins have increased 79%. Jerseys, I think, went backwards on milk volume. Holsteins are up 153% on fat and 192% on protein. The Jerseys are flat, right? So who's not learning the lesson about genomics? The Jerseys are not learning the lesson, right? And the Holsteins are, and they're just going to smoke them if they don't get it figured out.
Yeah. Well, let's thank Dr. Amburgh.